we should always work to persuade someone that there is a future, that there is a positive alternative, even in what can seem like the bleakest of circumstances.
Welcome to Assisted. I'm Chelsea Roff. Assisted dying is said to be a compassionate, caring choice.
In this series, we explore why it's not that simple. I'm Fiona McKenzie, and we'll look at why assisted dying has such a big impact on women.
We're delighted to be here today with Professor Louis Appleby, who is an academic who spent his career researching suicide prevention. He's also the government advisor on suicide prevention. And I want to begin, Professor Appleby, by asking how you found your way to this work and to this conversation.
Well, it's a good question. I suppose my starting point for this and much else is the suicide prevention perspective. So, as you said, I've worked in that field for a long time. I'm a psychiatrist by trade. I used to be in clinical practice. I ran a mental health service in Manchester, and then became more and more involved in research on suicide prevention, and now have this advisory role with the government. Though it's worth saying that I don't speak for the government. I'm there's an independent academic, and that means and to academics, independence is absolutely everything. So you don't get if nobody ever asks me to say anything that they want a view that they want to put around. So it's so I'm basically an academic who's interested in evidence, and the evidence on suicide prevention, something I've spent my career exploring. And one interesting thing about assisted dying is it's always felt quite separate from suicide prevention, and suicide prevention has developed enormously in the last sort of 20, 30 years, but it's slightly sidestepped issues of assisted dying. I think it's often been seen by assisted dying campaigners as being different, and it's possibly been seen by suicide prevention experts as a difficult area, a tricky area to get involved in, where some of the issues are the same as conventional suicide prevention, but others are clearly a little bit distinct. And so my perspective is a suicide prevention one, and for that reason, my starting point is that we should always work to persuade someone who wants to take their own life that there is a future, that there is a positive alternative, even in what can seem like the bleakest of circumstances. And bleak circumstances come in different forms. So everyone in suicide prevention has worked with and has had to study human despair. And our job is to try to present something which is less despairing, I suppose.
I don't know much about official suicide prevention work, but as a member of the public, I've seen lots of things around messaging to make sure that you don't encourage suicidality in other people, and to intervene, so to not be a bystander. If you see someone who looks troubled, you intervene. There's this sort of real interventionist approach that's encouraged. And like you, I was really puzzled by the switch, the sort of different tone that's used in some of the assisted dying campaign, which is actually sort of saying that lots of people who get a terminal diagnosis feel suicidal or attempt suicide, and the cure for this is assisted dying. And that seems like a jump. And actually we saw that in the evidence the committee heard from the Australian MP who was invited along, and he said that their assisted dying is actually a form of suicide prevention. I mean, what does that make sense to you as an argument?
No. Yes. It's complete nonsense. And for me, it no disrespect to that particular person, but it sounded like something that might be said to a different audience, to an audience of committed supporters who might see it as successful sales talk. It bears no relation at all to the idea of what real suicide prevention is about. So I didn't, I'm afraid, see that as a helpful contribution, and I suspect I wasn't alone. You make an interesting point, though, about society's view of suicide prevention. I think this is a really important area. It's important to me that that throughout my career, one thing has never been in dispute, and that is that society wanted us to prevent suicide. So I've never. Occasionally, of course, people will raise philosophical issues about sort of free will and so on, but and about so-called rational suicide. But these become slightly sort of rarefied debates in academia. They don't usually spill out into real life, and so it's a remarkable thing that on such an issue that there is a consensus, a kind of inviolable consensus, really, that we should try to prevent suicide. That when somebody is in despair, when they're facing a strong sense that they should end their life, that they see nothing positive, they've lost hope. Essentially, a lot of this is about hope. We should try to intervene. We should certainly try to persuade them, but we should try to intervene. We shouldn't stop at dissuasion, but because that might not work. We should actually intervene. We should stop people who might want to take their own lives, and society has never really challenged that very much. It's a very interesting thing that this humane, I would see, a humane, respectful determination that human life is valuable, and that we need to persuade somebody of that if they're taking a different view. It's just, if you think back over centuries, there's never really been somebody who said, well, let's not do that anymore. Nobody ever says to me, we think you should stop doing your research now. It's not really needed. This is a really important commitment to society. And you're touching on some good examples, I would say. So, we when people are in distress and despair, we look out for them. We make sure that nothing will happen to them. If we see a stranger on a bridge looking pensive, we go and talk to them. We have a whole service, mental health services, whose prime purpose is to make sure people survive. People don't kill themselves. We even have mental health legislation to make it possible for them to do that against a sort of resistance, if you like. And so that strength. I want to emphasize that this tremendous, well-established, previously unchallengeable idea that human life is worth it, despite everything, is for me very powerful. And now we're in a situation where, on this particular issue, people want to chip away at that historical consensus. And for me, that's very dangerous. It's saying, yes, but in certain circumstances, yes, but there are exceptions, yes, but life maybe is that bad. And I think that once we concede that, if we were to concede that, it would have a profound effect on how we view suicide prevention more generally. Once we've given up the ground that says human life is always worth preserving, then I think we're going to be in difficulties dealing with people who are facing other kinds of despair, because there are many types of despair.
Another question, but I just wanted to mention an example I found buried in the written evidence last week, where someone in Oregon had been given assisted death. He was terminally ill, he had a diagnosis that qualified him, but the doctor actually asked, "Why do you want this?" And he said, "Oh, I don't have any friends," because he qualified, and he was assisted to death, and that just seems to me to be unnaturally bleak place to be.
So that's extraordinary, really, isn't it? That it comes to that. But I think that's where you go when you take this step.
I'm interested in this observation that that giving that ground, really, like, essentially saying that it's okay to end some people's lives but not others, may chip away at our suicide prevention efforts. And I feel like in order to get there, we've had to see this we've seen this Orwellian use of language. I remember watching the committee and hearing that suicide only happens in healthy people. So only healthy people commit suicide. If these individuals are dying, then it's no longer assisted suicide. So there's been a real effort to try to distinguish assisted death and assisted suicide as if they're two different things.
Well, I understand why they try to make that distinction, and I think we have to recognise that this is a particular circumstance. I don't disagree that there is that they're trying to that it's not an unreasonable argument to say here is a particular situation that we think might change the rules a little bit, change the way in which society responds. So I get it. I don't criticise that. I mean, I think people are. They are responding in the end to the stories that families tell, and none of us can listen to those stories without feeling tremendous sympathy for people. And people have been through terrible final days or months, and as a society, we should be outraged by that and want to do something about that. So I completely get the motivation and the need to try to carve out a way in which we can do things differently. I do think that's it. You know, I quite often say I'm not actually opposed to assisted dying, and the reason I say that is that I fear it will make me look like I'm in some way opposed to those people and their stories. And that I feel uncomfortable with that. And you know, you listen to these heartfelt tales from families about things that happen to them, and you know, you can have, there's so much sympathy that that we need to start with when we talk about their experience. That it feels odd to say, well, in the end, however, I'm in opposition to you. I don't really feel that. I just think there are some assumptions there that I don't share, and that I think we should be diverting ourselves away from. So on your point about, is it the same? The trouble is, I think, I sometimes think that some of the people who are confidently giving their views about suicide have never met a suicidal person. Suicide is almost always complex. So there's a bit of a truism in suicide prevention that suicide doesn't have one cause, it doesn't have one sort of route to prevention, because the causes are often multiple and complex. People's lives are complex. You know, we live complex lives. Rarely do we do things for one reason only. Although there may be one dominant factor. So there are certainly situations where a person might have been influenced by a particular thing that happened, a particular circumstance, a particular stress that they're facing. But other factors will always have played a part. And in suicide prevention generally, of course, we meet people who've got whatever else they're facing. They may well have physical illness and physical disability and pain. And that's affecting their view of the world. They may well be feeling isolated from their families. They may well look at the future and feel that it's not going to get better for them. So you know, these are common. These are basically the core views, the core experience, if you like, of people who are suicidal for whatever reason. So those factors are always around, or likely to be around. So when you put it like, when I put it like that, it's not very different from talking about somebody who's terminally ill, where issues of pain and disability and seeing a rather dark future and feeling isolated, those are bound to be influencing the person who is taking an interest, maybe seeking, requesting assisted dying. They're bound to be influenced not just by the terminal illness, in many cases at least, but by these other factors which are common to everybody who feels that they want to give up. And so that's one thing. The distinction isn't clear to me. That I can see there are differences. I just don't think there's a distinction, as if there is a line between where, you know, where, you know, at which there's a divide and there's no crossover. And the importance of that for me is, first of all, that sort of conceptual thing. It's not so different, but it's also about putting it right. That many of these factors are remediable. Isolation is remediable. People the way people look at the future, you know, that can be different. There are people who feel their lives are over for different reasons, sometimes for financial reasons, sometimes for family reasons, sometimes because they've lost a person they care for. There are lots of reasons why people see the future has been taken away from them, and we try to get those people through that. So, you know, it's in the end, it's about remediable factors which are present, whatever is the core motivation.
Well, I think what you're talking about there is that suicidality is passing, like it goes away. So intervening is worth doing because people don't always just feel like that forever, that they change their minds. Is that a sort of also truism that suicidality is fleeting?
Well, in general it is. So, you know, a person who makes a very serious suicide attempt but survives and then ends up seeing people who might help. So it might be mental health services, they might receive treatment, or they might just get help with whatever were the stresses that they were facing. They don't immediately come out of that and go straight back to a further suicide attempt. most people who survive a suicide attempt, even a serious suicide attempt, survive and carry on living. You know, they don't return to it at the first possible opportunity. They return to they return to life. And so I think we have to see that suicide prevention works. We can help people see a different future. It may not be a future without stresses and, you know, fears and all of that, but it can be more positive. And of course, the supporters of assisted dying would say, well, yes, but this is different. This is terminal illness when things won't change. But of course, there are aspects of terminal illness which can change. You know, I'm always impressed when I hear the palliative care physicians talking about what more they can do, and how they rarely see somebody for whom they can do nothing. So, in fact, some will say they never see somebody for whom they can do nothing, and I'm impressed by that and persuaded by that, and I think that's how we have to view it. It's not the danger here is seeing that terminal illness is that sort of immutable thing, and you know, if we did the when we look at who some of the people are who die after a diagnosis of a very serious illness, die by suicide after that kind of diagnosis, they're not all in the same position. So I was involved with an ONS study, Office for National Statistics study, actually with Catherine Sleeman, who you will know, and was a palliative care physician, and we both helped advise ONS on this study, in which there was a higher rate of suicide in people who received a diagnosis of what was regarded as a life-threatening illness, so essentially a terminal illness, although it wasn't absolutely identically that. And but there was an initial increase in suicide risk, and then although that suicide risk continued, it sort of leveled off a little bit, and so there was a sense that there was an early reaction from people facing a new diagnosis, which, if you know, in clinical practice, is very familiar. People feeling, that's it, my life is already over. There's nothing now to live for. But then you help people through that, and yes, they're still concerned about the future. They're still facing difficulties. We can't deny that. But they've moved on from that feeling that it's already over for me. And we just have to have that in mind. You can get people through certain crises, and you can help them live a life that's acceptable.
Yeah.
And that's what has to be our goal, I think.
Yeah, I've come to this topic through a very narrow lens, really, which is working with people with eating disorders, and I'm sure you'll know from some of your research, which I've been gifted to be able to read and learn about suicide risk in this population myself. But it's one of the leading causes of death in people with eating disorders is suicide, and you know, I find it really tragic that in some countries, people that we know have very high risk of suicide have been understood as terminally ill, particularly in the US, and granted access to assisted death. And again, that kind of distinction between assisted suicide and assisted death falls apart, particularly when you're looking at a young woman with anorexia who, you know, just weeks before had attempted suicide, but then weeks later goes to her doctor and says, I don't see a future for myself anymore, and is handed lethal medications. So I feel like it's where that argument, you can see it most clearly. But I wondered, you know, knowing that definition of terminal is, while it might look very solid on paper, is sometimes open to interpretation when it's executed, when a law is executed in the realities of a healthcare system. I wonder if you could speak to how some of the gaps in mental health care and gaps in suicide prevention in a country may heighten that risk. And I know that's a kind of twofold question, but, you know, given a person may be deemed terminally ill and actually have many more months than 6 months to live, how does that kind of intersect with the fact that it may be very difficult to access the care that they need, whether that's mental health care or physical care for the physical conditions?
You're right. That is several questions in one there.
Sorry.
Can I first of all just respond to your point about terminal
Sure.
anorexia nervosa,
Yeah.
so-called, because I think it is a really good example of where some of these issues come together. So in one of my earlier answers, I was making reference to the fact that people in whatever their situation, they'll have a set of common risk factors. So you can't say, well, this is about physical illness, and then we've got suicide prevention generally, that's about mental illness, because actually the two often coexist, And in any case, they often create each other. There's a lot of interplay between physical and mental health. And some of that does come together in anorexia, where some of them, of course, there's a high risk of suicide anyway, but there is also a risk of physical death because of the physical consequences of anorexia. And that we have to see that as being open to intervention. In other words, this an example of the remediable risks that I was talking about earlier. I must say I'm appalled by the development of the notion of terminal anorexia, the idea of giving up on people because they have what they've, it's almost as if we say, well, if it was just mental illness, we would do something, but this is actually physical illness. You're entitled to make decisions about that. It's become something that's not reversing. So by definition, you've now got a terminal illness. That to me is an extraordinary way for health practitioners to reason. And I'm completely opposed to it. And it's not easy. I used to specialize in eating disorders when in an earlier part of my career. It's not easy dealing with people who've got a very severe eating disorder, but it's another situation where we have to try to present people with the alternative. And sometimes that can mean intervening, and sometimes not agreeing with how they see their future or what they want to do about their care. And that's a difficult area because it doesn't fit with the choice zeitgeist. But I think it does recognize that choices people make are not always the best choice. And of course, we have to try and respect choice. But I don't see choice as just being more important than everything else, including our responsibility as a society to people in distress and in difficulties who might need us to get them through the crisis into the next phase of their life. So I'm very worried about terminal anorexia. I'm sorry that's such a bad thing.
It's horrifying. I mean, and I'm so struck with you saying about this post-diagnosis, we need to get people through a really serious diagnosis. That we spoke to Leonie Harks, who's a palliative care expert in Canada. She told us of a patient she had who just had a diagnosis, was actively suicidal. She called a psychiatrist to come and talk to him, to help him, to give him suicide prevention. And the man was instead sent away with a phone number to call for euthanasia from aid. And that is they warned us that's the danger of this as a healthcare treatment, that it becomes something you have to offer, and it becomes a lot easier to offer it than hand-holding someone through a really difficult time in their life.
People are talking about it now as a service in some of that, which I find that language very jarring. It's just a dying service with all the implications of that, as if this is how we serve people. But also I'm afraid that opening up the opportunity for some more entrepreneurial and less principled people out there to say, well, that's the kind of service I could run. And I'm worried about that. I want to come back to your other question about what happens if mental health services are not able to support you in the right way. And I think mental health services find themselves under a lot of strain. Demand in society has greatly increased. So even though services have expanded very much since my career started, the demand has outstripped that increase, and that has had quite a lot of effects on how mental health services choose who to help and who not to help. And it's a painful thing to talk about because it feels critical of colleagues who I know are working hard and under pressure. But I think sometimes we get this wrong, and I think we do it because sometimes we feel we're not going to be able to help. So it's how do we deal with professional failure? How do we deal with recognizing that there may be limits to our capabilities as therapists or as a service? And when that happens, I think it forces people to become fatalistic, the staff that is, to become fatalistic. And by becoming fatalistic, we can also become rejecting. At that point, we start to reject people who need us. And this happens in mental health services, I'm afraid. And I fear that it's that side of mental health that the suicidal debate may play to. That suicidal feelings, which you can, in one sense, justify. I've explained why I don't accept that, but in a sense, they may be justified, and the certain prospect that this will be difficult, that supporting people may not be straightforward. This is a person facing real difficulties that we may not be able to change for them, and And so my fear is that mental health will, that one of those gaps in mental health will be this group of people who might need mental health input because of those kind of human frailties in us, in the therapists and in the
Yeah.
service that we offer.
Yeah. I know Fiona will have the last question here, but I'll just say compounded by resource constraints within
Yeah.
mental health services. It's both those, that I've taken to call it, I've heard it called therapeutic nihilism, which is a very kind of sharp way of putting it. I've also heard it called something around was it something around abandonment or something along those lines, which are very sharp ways to put it. But I love that you just spoke to frailties. These are very, very difficult for eating disorders anyway. They're very difficult to treat. And sometimes the person that you're offering support to is saying, I don't want help. I don't want to get better. I'm done. This is as good as it gets. But if you compound that with also having very few beds available and going, well, we've got somebody that really does want to get better, then I worry about those individuals who slip through the cracks. And I worry that if we have a
Yes.
so-called service to catch them and give them a quote compassionate seeing out, that crack might get larger and larger.
And then I think I agree with that. And I think on top of that, you've got the difficulty that that playing into that sort of professional dilemma, if you like, where can I help, can I not help? I think is the nature of mental ill health, and you could say the nature of mental capacity, which is the other thing that's been debated in this assisted dying debate. These are not easy concepts. So of course, if a person's got a severe psychosis, that you find everybody, I would think, would say they've got a mental illness. But once you get into lesser degrees of depression, which may be fluctuating and may also have that sense of understandability, that rational sense that I was talking about earlier, that where we say, well, yes, of course, of course they're facing these difficulties. Of course, they're going to feel that way. So it can't be a mental health problem. And so you have to judge the sense of disproportion, whether it will be enduring, and deal with the fact that it may change from day to day. The depression may fluctuate in intensity. Once you put that in, then it no longer is quite so easy for anyone to say, well, this person is depressed and therefore they should be out of the scope of this legislation. Or well, no, that doesn't quite meet depression. This is not really depression. This is somebody sad because of the situation they're in. Or they're not as, it's not as sad as they were before. It's not as intense as we thought. There are various ways in which people can back away from the intervention, the difficult intervention that they might otherwise have to make. And so that dividing line of illness versus non-illness in relation to mental illness is not a clear one. And nobody in mental health would ever think it was. It's only people making the law who might think it really is. And the same goes for capacity. People talk about capacity if it's a sort of thing, as if it's a blood test. So you can sort of do it, put it into the machine and you get your answer, yes, it's yes or no. But,
Yeah.
it's just not like that. And again, I fear that, well, let me put it in generous terms, that the people putting the bill together have overestimated our abilities to make clear judgments on some of the most complex human characteristics.
Yeah, overestimating your capacity.
Our capacity, yeah,
Indeed.
I just wanted to touch briefly on domestic abuse and suicidality as a trigger. So the problem about a service like the one that has been proposed in Parliament is that the numbers start to get very big. So we might have 10,000 people, 9,000 people a year dying by assisted dying if we end up like Australia, if we have the same kind of take. It's a lot of people. And a lot of those will be domestic abuse victims. And I think this is the thing I struggle with most, is that essentially what you have is you have a sort of suicide service which causes the death of people who are domestic abuse victims. And we then, on the other hand, have this recognition in government that actually preventing the suicide of domestic abuse is a huge priority and something we really need to get onto. Do you think... I can't get my head around this. I mean, does this make any sense to you that actually suicide is okay? Suicide is okay if you are terminally ill.
But my worry is that this is the rational suicide argument that which I think appeals to people. And if you acknowledge how many difficulties some people's lives are full of real problems, and if you allow for that to justify ending your life, then I think you miss a lot of potentially successful interventions. And domestic abuse would be an example of that, I think, where not that it's an easy thing to intervene over, but it's something that we should as a society commit to supporting people through, and it should not be allowed to play a part in this kind of end-of-life decision. That it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting example because partly because I think there's much greater recognition of how how important it has become, how prevalent it is, how important it has become in suicide prevention generally. I think it's become a sort of example of something that you see a lot in suicide prevention, which is whatever the problems that people are facing, that there are some common elements which slightly transcend the individual risks. So, and that is that whatever circumstances people are in, to get suicidal, they may well feel that they're trapped. They're in a situation they can't escape from. And that idea, and so in the end, suicide becomes the escape. And we have to see that's what some people are saying when they say, I'm suicidal, I want to end my life. They're saying, I need to escape from this. It applies to so many situations, so many different situations. It certainly applies to people who are essentially trapped. I mean, they are often literally trapped in an abusive relationship, an abusive household. You can be trapped in this. I mean, it really plays out literally, but it also plays out in other ways. People in all sorts of situations where they feel the system is against them, being in debt, facing judicial proceedings. There are all sorts of ways in which we can feel that we're trapped, and our way of getting out of being trapped is that life itself has to come to an end. Mm. My worry is that when you apply that to mainstream mental health, there are certain sorts of people. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but there is characteristics of people that makes them more of a concern to suicide prevention services, and these are people who might have certain kinds of diagnosis. Sometimes it's depression, but sometimes it's PTSD, or it's so-called personality disorder. This is not a diagnosis I like, but it's in widespread use because it can be a slightly critical condemnation of a patient rather than a sort of clinical concept. But in any case, it's in widespread use, and so there might be a certain sort of diagnosis, a certain kind of experience. So people who are traumatized in their lives, victims of abuse, so getting close to the group that you're referring to. So those are people who sometimes fall out with services. They're not the people. Services sometimes withdraw from those people and feel, well, we can't offer you anything, or maybe you've sort of slightly caused your own difficulties. There's not much we can do. And then we get into this area. Well, you might have capacity, you might have the right to choose, and there's nothing much we can do to intervene. So we're getting into similar concepts in relation to mental illness. Now, the reason this is really important and links to abuse is that this is exactly the kind of person who, in countries where assisted dying is allowed for reasons of mental illness, those are the people who then get caught up in that. And they are the people who are, in a humane mental health system, are the priority for suicide prevention. But they have slipped out of that in some countries to become, to find that they are eligible, not for the state, not only to say, we're not going to intervene, but we're going to assist your suicide. I mean, how extraordinary can that be? To shift from a priority group that we should go the extra mile to support, to a group who we would say, we're not only not going to intervene, we're going to actually make it easier.
Yeah, I have to, this resonates so much because we saw this so vividly in our research. We get to read cases, and if you look in the Netherlands, personality disorders, the diagnosis are overrepresented in what is called psychiatric euthanasia, where a person sought euthanasia for reasons related to mental distress or mental suffering. And you see very high rates of personality disorders, and you see even sometimes in the language of the assessing doctor. I remember one case where the doctor said, well, she wasn't even grateful that her life had been saved the last time she attempted suicide. And I was like, oh, wow. She wasn't even grateful, and using that as a justification to say, thus, assisting in her death is a reasonable, is a compassionate and a reasonable response, because of course, if she wasn't grateful to us doctors at that moment, and you see a lot of the language, a person, quote, we saw this a couple of times, lacks reflective capacity or lacks insight into their illness. And so all of those things that we, as you said, we usually see as factors that put a person at risk. These are people that we want to reach out to, that we want to, make sure that they have more access to services, are then used to actually say, well, this is the best thing we can do, or the most compassionate thing we can do is assist them in ending their lives. And
it's a very interesting thing how the lexicon has been rewritten so that these words mean different things. Compassion now means something different, and to quote the example you gave me earlier, that suicide prevention now means something different. It means helping somebody to take their own life. I mean, this is we're in a very strange world where words are used to mean the opposite of what they actually mean. And but the point about that group of people, I mean, to be fair to the people who are proposing the current bill in this country, they would say that's not what we're talking about. We want to pull away from that. It's not about what happens in the Netherlands or Belgium, and maybe in Canada. This is about people with terminal illness. We were very clear on that, and I think it's important to take people as sort of honest. Most people are trying to do the right thing most of the time. So I do believe that is what they would prefer to do. But I'm pointing out, and I suppose in this conversation you're pointing out the difficulties of holding that line, when it's not easy to say, well, here is mental disorder and here is no mental disorder. That's not an easy line. Here is capacity. Here is an absence of mental capacity. That's not an easy line. Here, this is a physical problem. That's a mental problem. That's not an easy line to draw. And when we're talking about people who have a constellation of problems, those complex lives that I was referring to, that feeling of being trapped, and these other factors. Domestic abuse is the one we've been talking about in the last few minutes, but there are other factors too. It's an important one. There are other factors which just add to that sense of that life is over for me. There's no way out for me. That we're talking about quite nuanced judgments at times, and I think you'd have to be. That's not a comfortable position. Nuanced judgments on either side of a vague line. I don't know whether the law should be built on that when people's survival is at stake. And not only that, but society's values are undermined. I just cannot see that is the right way forward. I mean, having said that, I think we're in a difficult position now because there is I just want to say, in order to sound fair, I think there is clearly a strong public sense that we need something like this, and I think we have to be prepared to argue in those terms. I think we have to recognise, and if we're not, and so I spend a bit of time. I often think, well, so maybe I need to accept that I'm in a minority here, and this is what people want, and so where am I going to try and draw the sort of line of humane practice? And then whenever I get into the examples, I find I can't. I said, no, I don't like that example. I don't like that one. And I think I still cannot quite get beyond the sense that these very sad stories, which I genuinely believe are touching and heartfelt, that they don't automatically translate into workable legislation. They translate into a human story that we must respond to, but they don't necessarily determine the response. And that's where I think the MPs have got a difficult task, because they are very driven by the stories that people tell them. That's what we want from them. They're our representatives. We want them to listen to our stories, but those stories are not the only issue, and they may not take us to the right conclusion.
Yeah. Well,
who doesn't want to end suffering of terminally ill people? But this solution has to work for the rest of society, and I share your views.
And to quote Baroness Tanny Gray-Thompson, who was on with us a couple of weeks ago, the devil is in the details. And I think it's Professor Kathleen Sleeman who said, we need to be really honest about what level of collateral damage we're okay with.
I think that's a very important point. One final thing is we haven't talked about, but it matters a lot to me, and that is what this says about medical ethics. As a doctor, I don't feel this is the kind of medicine I was signing up to. And of course, people will say, well, you don't have to be involved. But okay, somebody like me feeling that they didn't want to be involved, but having a patient say that's what they want. The bill as it's written says, well, you don't have to make the referral to the assisted dying service, but you have to pass on that patient to somebody who may. So for me, that's involved. So I don't, and so that's the first thing. I don't buy the idea of non-involvement. But secondly, I think this is about the profession as a whole. If medicine moves in a way that I no longer recognise, with the kind of ethical code that I feel that we try to live by in our practice, if that happens, that's not just an issue for the doctors taking part. This is an issue for us as a profession, our professional values, the ones that our sort of, if you like, our status in society depends on, and the trust that society places in us. It's much more profound than just saying, well, we'll find doctors who feel okay with it. It's not about that. It's about what we expect from the medical profession, in whom we bestow such kind of privilege and trust. It feels to me that this is going against that.
Hi, it's Fiona. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to The Other Half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. So grateful for this, and so grateful for you listening, though. Thank you.